All right, so a happy Rosh Chodesh Elul to everyone. And we were just talking about the calendar before we got the tape rolling. Showing my age by saying tape, aren't I? But the whole complicated system of working out the calendar is actually something that was not how Torah originally imagined the calendar would be worked out. Originally, the Torah said that we would decide months how. Anyone ever come across that before?
Two witnesses.
Two witnesses.
See the moon. And
eyewitnesses.
Run to Jerusalem.
Guys who saw the moon, that is to say, saw the crescent of the moon, the new moon in the sky, would go to Jerusalem and they'd say, "I saw the moon." And the judges, the rabbis in Jerusalem would say, "Well, did it look like this or did it look like that?" to make sure that it was exactly the new moon and not, some strange flock of birds or clouds. And once they were sure that the testimony was indeed true, they would say, "The new month has begun." And everybody would be then informed throughout Israel and throughout the diaspora that we now have a new month. And part of that process was what led to having a second day Yom Tov in places outside of Israel, because it took time for word to travel. If you didn't know when the month had been declared, then you would hedge your bets and you'd celebrate it on both days, because one or the other had to be the day, because you knew when last month was made and you know how long the month was supposed to be, so it could only be one day off, so you'd celebrate on 2 days. But that leads then to the question of, so we are deciding when Passover is, not because that is when Passover is, but because that's when we counted from when two guys came and the judges accepted their testimony. You see the distinction? It wasn't as though we actually had a perfect atomic clock that was counting down from the original day of the Exodus, and every 365 days it would go beep, and we'd know that it was Passover again. We were only counting based upon the eyewitness testimony of guys who were just looking up at the moon. That's enough? I mean, to do Passover on the right day? I mean, to make sure that all of our holiday cycles, it's eyewitness testimony. And remember, the only reason we stopped doing that was because we no longer had the Sanhedrin, the court in Jerusalem, from which to make those promulgations and to do that testimony. So the role of judgment, the role of judges, the role of testimony is central to Judaism. And as we begin Parashat Shoftim, we're going to see a lot of discussion of what role those judges have, and then we're going to look at some commentary on the extent that authority, how far does that authority extend? Sound like a plan? Excellent. So we are in Parashat Shoftim, which is on page 1088. It's chapter 16, verse 18. If you're looking in another copy of the Torah, chapter 16, verse 18 of Deuteronomy, Devarim. Would anyone like to lead off? Come on, some of our regular readers are on vacation or not here, so we need other people to volunteer. Come on.
What page?
We're page 1088. No, you haven't read for a while.
You shall appoint magistrates and officials for your tribes, and all the settlements that the Lord your God is giving you, and you shall govern the people with due justice. You shall not judge unfairly, you shall show no partiality. You shall not take bribes, for bribes blind the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea of the just. Justice shall you pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not set up a sacred post, any kind of pole besides the altar of the Lord your God that you may make, or erect a stone pillar, for such the Lord your God.
All right. So apart from the admonition of idolatry, which may or may not have a connection to the main thrust of this section, what do we now know about importance of judges, justice, and that whole ball of wax for the Torah? Big deal, little deal?
They were appointed positions.
They were appointed positions.
And they were charged with being fair.
and they had to be fair. So first of all, appointed positions as opposed to, what would the alternatives have been?
Election of some sort.
Well, we as good modern people might imagine there could be a form of election. It's not necessarily true that they were not ratified by their communities. Indeed, most of Jewish history has seen that rabbis may have been appointed as rabbi, but they had to be accepted by their community to serve as rabbi. So there may have been some balance of what the people did or did not accept in terms of their magistrates. But the other option, of course, would be don't appoint judges, but instead allow each person to judge entirely on their own. Right? Why do we need judges? Why do we need officials? God gave Torah to everyone. So if you stole something from me, I can read Torah and see what I need to do, and I'll do it. Or me and 20 of my friends will go do it to you in your house. Why do we need judges?
Presumably because you have people who have bias one way or another, as may occur if you're looking out for yourself.
Because we are looking not just that the Torah be implemented as I see fit, but that tzedek be done, that justice will be done. And justice, there seems to be this implication, needs to be blind to other considerations, that it needs to not bow to bribery, it needs to, as we're going to see, be open to all information, and therefore it's just random individuals. We might just possibly have the tendency to do what we wanted rather than to do what was actually tzedek, what was actually justice. And so we get this very famous line, tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. That it's not just enough to say, I want justice. It's not just enough to say, hey, we got judges, we got justice. You have to actively pursue justice. And we will come back to that verse later on in our discussion. Questions or comments so far?
Well, wasn't it Korach's argument against Moshe that, we all got Torah, so why are you putting yourself up above anyone else? So that didn't work. We found out that didn't work, so maybe that's why we have justice.
Right. So Korach, that we might say, was making a theological claim as opposed to a judicial claim. That Korach, if those of you remember, was saying we are all holy and we all have access to God. We all have the right to conduct the worship services. Why should it just be Aaron and his sons? Whereas judging, well, okay, maybe he wasn't arguing about that. Now, he might have been as well, and certainly Korach had a lot of different agendas going on there, a lot of different axes to grind. But we might have thought that he was only limited to the worship issue. And here we're getting a broader definition that no, we don't need just people in the tabernacle. We also need people to make sure that justice as Torah wants it will be administered throughout the land, and can't just leave that to any old individual, any old time.
You have to know the law, and not everybody knows the law as well as hopefully the people who are appointed.
And that tension of knowing the law is going to come back, because how much law do you need to know then to know what I should do day in, day out? How much, if I'm trusted to know what I'm going to eat and what I'm going to do on Shabbat and what I'm going to do in my business, well, why can't I be a judge? And if I'm not trusted because you don't think I'm learned enough, then shouldn't someone be appointed to, watch over me to make sure I don't transgress? So what balance is there given to the individual, and what balance of authority is given to the judge? Hold that question in the back of your brain. Let's keep reading. Chapter 17 now.
You shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep that has any defect of a serious kind, for that is abhorrent of the Lord your God. If there is found among you in one of the settlements that the Lord your God is giving you, a man or a woman who has affronted the Lord your God and transgressed his covenant, turning to the worship of other gods and bowing down to them, to the sun or the moon or any of the heavenly hosts, something I never death and the testimony of the sake of the witness. Let the hands of the witnesses be the first against him to be put to death, and the hands of the rest of the people thereafter. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst.
All right. Case study. That is to say, we've just been talking about justice, and now we're getting an example of what justice can mean. Now, had we not just been discussing appointing judges, you might think that this is a call to personal zeal. That is to say, I saw my neighbor bowing down to his little statue, therefore I'm going to drag him to the town square and kill him. In context, however, because we've just finished talking about having judges and having laws, when we read then in the middle of verse 4, you shall make a thorough inquiry, and if it is true, the fact is established. And then we read again later on, down in verse 6, that a person should only be put to death on the testimony of 2 or more witnesses. We understand that this is not talking about righteous indignation of the individual, but this is talking about a case where obviously you need to have judges that will oversee these particular cases. That even something as abhorrent to God as idolatry doesn't give you, the individual, the right to go and execute your neighbor just because you think they're violating it. That there needs to be witnesses more than just you, and there needs to be a formal inquiry to make sure that the facts of the case are properly understood. And for all you know, he wasn't actually bowing down to the statue, he was bending over to dig a hole so he could bury the thing. And if you dragged him off and killed him without having a proper inquiry, well, wouldn't you look silly? Make sense? Okay, but what happens when you just can't figure it out?
If a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it a controversy over homicide, civil law, or assault, matters of dispute in your courts, you shall promptly repair to the place that the Lord your God will have chosen, and appear before the Levitical priests, or the magistrate in charge at the time, and present your problem. When they have announced to you the verdict of the case, you shall carry out the verdict that is announced to you from that place that the Lord chose, observing scrupulously all the instructions to you. You shall act in accordance with the instructions given to you and the ruling handed down to you. You must not deviate from the verdict that they announced. Act to you either to the right or to the left.
All right, but we're going to pause there. So, if your local court can't figure it out, if the case is just too hard, too complicated, they can't come to a conclusion, what happens? Go to a higher authority. The same way that we have a court system in America for appeals, they had a court system in ancient Israel and under rabbinic times as well, that the court itself didn't have to wait for an appeal request, could say, we can't figure this out, we're going to ask the next court up to take a look at it. And if that court couldn't figure it out, it would go up and up until it finally reached, eventually, the court, the Sanhedrin, that was established in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. And whatever that court decides, so be it. If they say this, you don't go to the right, you don't go to the left, you do exactly what they say. But what if they get it wrong? I mean, we're having this appeal process, or not necessarily appeal, we're having this elevation of the authority of the court to go up. But is there any guarantee that the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem will always be able to answer every case that the lower courts were unable to do so?
Nothing's 100% certain.
Nothing's 100% certain? Well,
Theologically, the Sanhedrin is supposed to be able to make 100%.
Well, let me give you two umpires are talking about doing their job. And the first umpire says, I'm the best umpire. Because whenever that pitcher throws it and it comes across the plate, I can tell exactly where the ball is. And if the ball is even just a tiny bit in the strike zone, it's a strike. And if it's not in the strike zone, it is a ball. And I call it like I see it, perfectly every single time. I don't care about the pressure, I don't care about the teams, and I would never, ever falsify what I see. And the other umpire says, no, you're not a good umpire at all. Because for me, until I call it, it's nothing. It's not that it was a ball or it was a strike, and I had to decide one way or the other. If I call it a strike, it's a strike. And if I call it a ball, it's a ball. And if I say nothing, there's nothing there. So there are two different ways of viewing the law and the judgment of the law. Either you are looking at a judge as being a technician, someone who is able to discern from the facts of the case and the details of the law exactly which rule should apply in these circumstances. That's the person who can see exactly where the ball is on the strike zone. And then they see it precisely, and that's what they call, and their job is done. Or you say, it's not exactly that hard and fast and clear cut. But in fact, the judgment the judge makes, or the umpire, creates what actually is ball or strike, creates what is right or wrong. And if the judge were to say something differently, it would be different. It wouldn't be that the umpire was wrong in what they called, because they can't be wrong, because they called it. So, to take a look at those different views, because they are reflected in more than just baseball, let's take a look at a few opinions of our tradition. Just let's say a quick straw poll, and don't worry, the video is only pointed at me. How many people are more comfortable with the idea that the law is what the law is, and it's the judge's duty to try and figure it out better than anyone else? And how many people are more comfortable with the notion that the law is what the judge decided, and it's the judgment that makes the law what it is? And how many people are just confused?
The rest of them.
Good! Exactly.
Judges don't make laws. Legislatures make laws. Judges judge according to the law. I mean, it's anything goes then. If the ends justify the means, anything goes. You know?
So let's take a look. Would you like to... what? But there always is interpretation.
But within boundaries.
Interpretations are judgment.
You can't just make the law.
Well, but hold on a second, because this maybe can clarify it a little bit. There are interpretations and there are boundaries. Those sound like reasonably congruent opinions, but they are, in fact, opposite. Because what you're saying is that there's interpretation within the boundaries only because different judges may be more or less perfect in their ability to discern the facts of the case. That means there are good judges and bad judges, purely as a technical matter. And the interpretation has nothing to do with the feeling of the judge, has nothing to do with their inspiration of the case. It has entirely to do with how well they can see, the clarity of their vision. Okay.
Yes, I believe that.
Good. Read the first text then, which is from Ramban, but it summarizes Rashi as well.
Even if they tell you on right that it is left, or on left that it is right, says Rashi.
All right, so the very last line that we read from the Torah says that you should do exactly as the judges tell you, and you should not deviate from it, neither to the right nor to the left. And Rashi picks up on that based on the Midrash and Siftei, and says that means even if they tell you that right is actually left and left is actually right, you do what they say. So if you go to the judge and he says, that pig is kosher, apparently, or we're using this as hyperbole, apparently that pig is kosher. And if they go to you and say that Shabbat is Sunday, if that's what the judge says, Shabbat is Sunday. Hyperbole. But that appears to be what Rashi is saying. And let's see what Rambam does with this. This is Ramban, also known as Nachmanides.
And the meaning is that even if you think in your heart that they are erring and the matter is plain in your eyes, as you can tell the difference between right and left, you should do as his command, and should not say, how can I eat this absolutely forbidden fat or kill this innocent man? Rather say, so commanded me the master who commanded on all the commandments to do in accordance with all the commandments as instructed by those standing before him in the place he chose. And as they understand, he gave the Torah, even if they make a mistake.
All right? Which means, when you think the judge has said that right is left, that black is white, that good is bad, you shouldn't think the judge made a mistake. But should instead think, God commanded, we just read the mitzvah, that you do what the judge says. Therefore, I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm not eating some forbidden fat, I'm not killing an innocent person, I'm doing what God wants because I'm doing what the judge says. And it's the judge who knows what God wants. Isn't that what we just said in Deuteronomy? Not seeing a lot of smiles for this opinion. Interesting. But surely isn't this the underpinning of having a community? That it's not based upon what I think is right? I mean, after all, the judge may say that something is right or wrong. Well, I don't know, in, say, a self-defense stand your ground case, and I may disagree. Well, what then? Does that mean that I'm allowed to take matters into my own hand and to punish people that I think should be punished, or to free people from prison that I think should be freed? Don't we in America follow this exact principle without the religious overtones, that once a case has been decided, the case has been decided, and we abide by it, or appeal it in certain cases, but once the appeals process has run out, we believe that we have done justice, and we are forced to abide by it, aren't we? Yes?
But I don't think we necessarily agree.
We are, but we don't necessarily agree. We may not want to, and we may not actually be forced to abide by it. As some of you may remember, there have been quite a few Supreme Court cases at different times in our history that have ratified very racist or exclusionary policies, which were then challenged by people in acts of civil disobedience, and which the Supreme Court would later reverse their decisions upon. So how do we hold to just judicial authority to interpret the law and implement the law, or do we not? Good. Glad that we're confused. Keep reading for me.
That's what the boundaries was.
What's that?
That's what the boundaries was.
That's what the boundaries is about.
Even if they tell you on right that you think that it is left, and on left that you think it is right, you should listen and not ascribe the mistake to him, but with yourself. For Hashem gave His Spirit on those serving in His temple, and the only truth would lead them out.
So, right. So Siftei ChaChamim, sorry, not ChaChamim. That should just be an H in front of that. Is a commentator on Rashi, and he says, why does Rashi say that you should go to the right, and even if it looks like it's left, and go to the left even if it looks like it's the right, if that's what the court says? Because God would not allow His judges to err. They are appointed by God, therefore their judgments are divinely sanctioned and appropriate. And in fact, it's almost a sense that God's Spirit has guided the judge, and therefore not only do you follow their authority, but you recognize in their ruling that that was exactly what God wanted the ruling to be. Again, not looking at a lot of smiles on this topic. We don't like the idea of having divinely sanctioned rules coming from our judges.
This was a theocracy. So why can't we abide by it?
It's
At the time.
At the time, it was a theocracy. We accepted that God was God, and we accepted that God asked us to do the commandments. And so doesn't that mean that if the people who are acting in accordance with the societal structure that God asked that we implement, this court system, make a ruling, that we should understand that we are doing what God wants, even if it looks like to us it's not what God wants? Or certainly if it's just what I don't think I want.
This presupposes that the judges have a direct connection to God, that God made them be judges because Moses picked them or whatever. Moses is not picking them. And I think the problem is that by and large, they're ordinary people. They not see things clearly too.
You mean
So this
you
is
mean
saying-
judges might make mistakes?
This is saying just because they're judges, they are imbued with some divine essence. That means anything that they say is divinely inspired and has to be right. And I don't think we can accept that.
Seems a little counter to what we would be hoping to find.
Well, this starts out with saying, when you're in the place that God chose, Jerusalem, and the priests are carrying out their daily sacrifices as they should, and the high priest is going into the Holy of Holies on a regular basis, under that condition, they are divinely inspired.
So one way to perhaps make us feel more comfortable today is to say, oh, well, this would have only taken place and this level of authority would have only happened when we could see God's presence in the temple, when we could see that we were actually living in the place that God had chosen, in the manner that he had chosen, and therefore we could ascribe a certain level of divine inspiration and guidance to our judges, because it would be apparent to all that this was what God wanted. By the mere manifestation of God's glory, we would understand that the judges have the authority to act in a way that, even if I don't understand it, must be what God wants. And that's a very comfortable position to take, because we can then say, under ideal circumstances, absolutely the judges should have this authority, but there ain't no ideal circumstances today, so I don't have to hand over my conscience to a judge and feel like somehow I'm abdicating personal responsibility. That's not the tack that's taken by most of our tradition, because most of our tradition does want to preserve some elements, and we're going to see there is room for this, there are boundaries, as we say, going to preserve some element of the authority of judges, the authority of rabbis. And they, I think, want to maintain some level of authority for rabbis and judges, because otherwise how do we function? If we don't have some structure of yielding some decision making and some authority to those who are appointed and versed in the law, then we don't have a community, we have just a disparate number of people living near each other who happen to also read the same book. And that's not what a community is. Not a religious community, it's not what a secular community is either. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, when God granted us the power of free will, that immediately sets up an obstacle for anything that we're told that we must do or should do, because we have power to decide whether that's something we want to do or we don't want to do.
Free will is very inconvenient for making sure that what God wants actually gets done. Absolutely. And yet, God gave it to us, and so we need to figure out a way to live with it and hopefully do good things with it.
You can also use it as an excuse to choose to do whatever you want to do.
Oh, we do it all the time, yes. It's a lovely excuse. But it comes back to this question of, can judges make mistakes? Or are judges considered inherently infallible in Judaism? Michael, you're reading so very nicely. And it's that or have to fish for another volunteer. So keep going.
English is my second language. If the court gave a decision to transgress any or all of the commandments which are stated in the Torah, and an individual went and acted in accord with their instructions, so transgressing inadvertently, 1, whether they carried out what they said, and he carried out what they said right along with them.
That is to say, let's make sure we got all the cases here, because this gets a little confusing in the middle, so I want to make sure we're all together. So a court, a Beit Din, a group of rabbis, issue a statement about whether it's allowed to plant these kinds of things here, whether it's allowed to bury these types of people here, whether this is kosher, not kosher, and by the admission of Mishnah itself, that is to say, this piece of rabbinic work, we know they made a mistake. We know they're wrong. They ruled incorrectly. So we already have this assumption that, yes, judges can make mistakes. Beit Dins can come to the wrong conclusion. And now we're working out what happens if I act on their statement and it turns out they were wrong. That make sense? What's my guilt for doing something wrong, but I'm only doing it because they said it was right? So the first case is when they carried out what they said and I carried out what they said, which means the judges are doing it and I'm doing it. So the judges say, this piece of cow is kosher, and they start eating it, and I say, well, they said it's kosher, and I start eating it. So they're doing it and I'm doing it. We're all doing it together based on their ruling, their incorrect ruling. Or
whether they carried out what they said and he carried out what they said after they did.
They ate it one day, I ate it the next day. Or
3, whether they did not carry out what they said, but he carried out what they said.
they said it's kosher, but they didn't want anything right now, thank you, they're not hungry, but I ate it anyway. In all 3 of these cases,
He is exempt since he relied on the court.
when it's later revealed that they were mistaken, I am not guilty of anything. I don't have to bring a sacrifice to the temple and ask for forgiveness from God. I don't have to do any sort of other punitive forms of damages, because I only did what the court had told me to do. So the court can make mistakes, but those acting upon the mistakes of the court are not considered guilty. How are we doing that? What's that? It's an honest mistake. They made an honest mistake. I followed their opinion honestly, thinking they were right. Therefore, I'm innocent of any wrongdoing. Doesn't mean I should keep doing it once I learn the right thing, but I don't have to worry about sin that I've accumulated from doing what the court said when it's revealed later on that they were wrong.
At Yom Kippur, part of our prayers are prayers of forgiveness for wrongs that we consciously knew about.
Yes.
And wrongs we didn't know.
Right. So there is another category of doing things inadvertently when we ought to have known better. And then there's a category of doing something inadvertently when we had no way to know better. And it's a little bit complicated of where you go between one and the other, but this is speaking to a very specific case of the second type of mistake, which is I thought explicitly I was doing the right thing because the court said it was the right thing, as opposed to I thought it was the right thing because I didn't know any better, or I thought it was the right thing because that just is how I remembered it, and I remembered it incorrectly. You know, I thought today was Saturday, but it wasn't. Tomorrow's Saturday, so I ended up transgressing Shabbat. Silly me! I can't believe I forgot what day it is. Have to bring an offering. But if the court tells me today is Shabbat and I observe Shabbat today, and then on the next day, which was really Shabbat, I break it, when I find out later on that the court was wrong, I'm not responsible for bringing a sacrifice and seeking forgiveness for having violated Shabbat in that second case, because I was relying upon the court. And that's what you're supposed to do. How are we doing? Uncomfortable with that whole relying on the court part?
Well, relying on authority. I mean, okay, look at the Nuremberg trials. And these people
I was
say,
only following orders.
innocent, I'm only following orders, right? So forth. So it sounds like that, and I'm not too sure since we have, as Sally said, free will.
Right.
At what point do we make our own moral judgments and say, he who is leading me or judging is
Well, tell you
like
what.
that, and I'm doing my way.
Since you're giving me such a beautiful segue to the second paragraph, would you like to read?
Okay.
This isn't meant as punishment for contributing, by the way. It's just it fits perfectly to your concern.
Okay.
If the court gave a decision.
Right, if the court gave a decision and one of them knew that they had erred, or a disciple who was worthy to give instruction, and he, who knew of the error, went and carried out what they said.
All right, so let's make sure we understand. We've got a court, and the court makes a decision. We'll stick with the what day of the week is it, because it's a very blatant and obvious thing that we can see a mistake happening. And they say that today is Shabbat when it's not Shabbat. Well, if one of the guys there is very learned and fit to make judgments, or even one of the court members knows that it's a mistake, but for whatever reason is not able to convince the others or to sway them to his opinion, or keeps his mouth shut for some unknown reason, and goes off and acts like tomorrow is not Shabbat, then?
One, whether they carried out what they said and he carried out what they said right along with them.
If they all go out for the barbecue on Shabbat?
Two, whether they carried out what they said and he carried out what they said after they did it.
or he waits for them to start the barbecue and then he joins them.
3, whether they did not carry out what they said, but he carried out what they said.
They don't have a barbecue, but I go home and start grilling on my own.
This one is liable, since he, who knew the law, did not in point of fact rely upon the court.
So, hold on a second, we'll get to the governing principle in just a moment. So if you know the law is wrong, the interpretation that the court has given is wrong, and you rely on their interpretation, you are guilty. You have violated whatever law it is that they were mistaken about. If they say this pig's kosher, and you know pigs aren't kosher, you can't say, well, hey, the court said it was okay, and the court's eating it, so I can eat it too. No. If you know the law well enough to know 100% that they are absolutely wrong in this, then you do not get to follow their mistaken ruling. What's that? So what do you do? We'll get to what do you do. But the come back to the Nuremberg question, if you know that exterminating entire groups of people is wrong, and you do it anyway because, well, everyone else was doing it, or because that's our law said it was legal and our judges said it was okay, you absolutely can still be held accountable by the true court of righteousness and say, no, that is not a valid defense.
Right, but you only have to follow a lawful order according to the UCMJ. So.
Correct. You only have to follow a lawful order. Exactly. And in this particular case, if you can tell explicitly, clearly that the law that they have promulgated is not lawful, and you follow it anyway, you are liable for your actions. And you can't just sit back and say, hey, they did it. They told me it was okay. Keep reading the governing principle then.
This is the governing principle. He who relies on himself is liable, and he who relies on the court is exempt.
All right, so to a certain degree, ignorance is protection. To a certain degree. If you really don't know about kashrut, and the court puts their stamp on a piece of meat and says it's kosher, and you can't tell what kind of meat it is, but you just see the stamp and you're relying on the court and you eat it, and you later find out that that was actually pork, you're not in trouble with God. You have not committed a sin. On the other hand, if you know what they've approved should not be approved, if your understanding of the law is clear enough that you can tell categorically 100% that they made a very clear mistake, not an interpretation, but a very clear mistake, you do not get to rely upon their ruling in order to excuse your behavior. Because you should be relying upon your own understanding, if it's that clear. Now, the distinction, of course, is, and what the sages were trying to say at the top, is there are cases where it is open for interpretation. There are cases where the judges will know more than you do about the law or about the facts of the case. And it may seem even that what they're saying is left is actually right, or what they're saying is right is actually left. But if there is some possible doubt that they have information or an understanding that you do not, and they share that understanding so you can try and follow it, then you should be willing to at least say, okay, maybe I don't understand this as well, and I will listen and heed their ruling. You shouldn't presume you always know exactly as much as every judge. You shouldn't presume that you have every fact of the case as clearly as every judge. But if you understand it very clearly, or if the facts are extremely clear in black and white, you can't sit back and simply say, hey, the judges said it was okay, so I'm doing it. We see the distinction? Maybe? Okay. Let's find another time for another way to put it into case practice. So anyone like to read a slightly humorous story? Okay, you want something a little funnier to take the edge off?
There was a stranger, non-resident Jew, who had a lawsuit with one of the wealthy men of the city. And the stranger saw that the judge wished to judge the case to its truthful conclusion, such that the stranger would win. And the wealthy man winked with his eye and bribed him secretly, and he tilted the judgment and ruled in favor of the wealthy man.
All right. A guy comes to the town, very common back in the Middle Ages and through much of our history, Jews traveling from one town to another. It was a common way of doing business. Came to the town. He gets into some form of commercial disagreement with one of the local wealthy guys. The case comes before the local Beit Din, the local judge. And the guy could tell that the judge saw the rightness of his case. But the wealthy guy did the old wink wink to the judge, and the judge suddenly began to incline more towards the wealthy local man and ruled in his favor. We see the facts of the case there? Right? So a wink and a nod, local guy and powerful guy pushes the stranger out from receiving the justice that was his due.
And on the Shabbat day, they were all in the synagogue, and the Chazan read Deuteronomy 1:17. You shall not respect persons in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. You shall not be afraid of the face of any man, for the judgment is God's, and the cause that is too hard for you, you shall bring to me, and I will hear. The victim arose furiously before the congregation and cried out a great and bitter cry. The Chazan is lying, he is lying, for the judgment is the wealthy's.
All right, so just imagine you're in shul, and we're reading from the Torah, just chanting along, and all of a sudden this guy shouts out, "That's not right!" Because what that Torah verse just said, that you shouldn't give any deference to those that are wealthy, that you shouldn't show favoritism, that you shouldn't accept bribes, that's not true. Because you do. You do show favoritism to the wealthy, you do accept bribes. Therefore, what the Chazan is saying is a lie in this community. Caused quite a stir, yes? And what should the response be? Sit down at Shabbos? Leave? The judge has already ruled. There's no appellate court, or we're talking about medieval Europe here. We don't have a Sanhedrin to throw it back to in Jerusalem. Well, what do you want us to do? It's Shabbos. Sit down, let us get on with the Torah reading, right?
Until the heads of the community sought after the matter and found it out, removed the judge and returned the law to its true state. I don't understand that sentence.
So what happened is that the heads of the community investigated this guy screaming out that justice has not been done, that the judge was bribed, and they begin to look into the matter. What's that?
And this is what the scripture states, that justice shall be pursued. The intent being that it is incumbent upon the important people to pursue and investigate after justice in order to make the judgment come out in its truth.
So the judgment does not only belong to the judge, but the community has the responsibility to ensure that the judges are actually adjudicating justly. It's a lot of J's in one sentence. And so this guy was screaming so long that he kept it up until the leaders of the community began to look into the case. And when they looked into the facts of the case, it was clear that the judge had ruled incorrectly. And then they were able to discern that he had ruled incorrectly because of a bribe. And so that judge was kicked out, and the proper award was given to the stranger who had been wronged. So there wasn't judicial oversight from other judges. It was considered incumbent upon every member of the community to ensure that their community was acting justly. And that if they saw a problem with how their judges were ruling, they should bring it to the attention of the community and try to find out whether there was actual malfeasance.
What's so provocative about it is that the stranger is not saying they're not doing this. He's saying, you were reading scripture, you're lying. That's not how it works. And that was very provocative to say, what?
Exactly. I mean,
the Torah's a lie?
Well, the Torah must be a lie because it must be lying because we're not living it.
Right.
If it was true, that's what we'd be doing. And since we're not doing it, it must be a lie. And the idea that our actions in our community can make a lie out of the Torah is extremely provocative. It's an extremely powerful statement. That if you're not living it, it's not just for you, you are making Torah into a lie. and that needs to be fixed. And we all have a responsibility to ensure it's being fixed. You don't just say, hey, he's the judge, whatever he decided is okay. Because we know, despite the early statements that judges, from the left and the right, and if they say right, it can be left, and beside all that statement of the deference and the authority the judges have, we've seen judges can be bribed, judges can make mistakes, judges can do all sorts of things wrong. And there needs to be an interaction with the rest of the community to make sure that it doesn't go the wrong direction, while at the same time not completely undermining the authority and cohesion that comes from having a judicial system. Yes? No? Maybe?
Well, when we started out, it says you appoint judges.
Mm-hmm.
If you appoint them, you can
You can depoint. Exactly. Once installed, you can uninstall. Absolutely. But it comes back to this phrase that we saw, tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. It means that it's not just enough to say we have justice because we have judges. It is incumbent upon each of us as a community, as individuals, to ensure that those who are given the job of making sure there is justice are actually making justice. We can't simply say we've done what we need to do, we appointed our judges. There has to be a continual process of watching what the judges do, of watching the judicial system, of making sure that the outcome is actually just as well. And that is the doubling of tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. Not just want, not just hope for, but pursue. Actively ensure that this happens. And in fact, that principle is taken so far that we'll see in the next two paragraphs some rather extreme circumstances.
What is the application of this lesson to today, to our judicial executive government?
It means constant vigilance. Now, does that mean that we question every decision that disagrees with our political philosophy? No. Does it mean we question every decision that we think, based upon what we saw on TV, went the wrong way? No. But does it mean that we as a society have a responsibility to ensure that there is a process of reviewing how cases were handled, of how judges are being done, of looking into the statistics of whether or not there seems to be patterns of one side or the other being treated differently, of discrimination and either leniency in punishments or over-punishment and such? Absolutely. We do need to be watchful, and we do need to be mindful, while at the same time recognizing that we don't know everything, and we can't second guess just because we saw a 15-second spot on TV, but that we should be watching to make sure that it really was. So we shouldn't be quick to judge the judges, but we also don't leave the judges unjudged. Does that make sense? Kind of. And if you think that's hard, if you think that's confusing, if you think that means it takes a lot of work, welcome to the work of pursuing righteousness. No one ever said it was going to be easy.
I sympathize with your concern. We have a problem because our judges are not appointed, they're elected. However, when they run, because of privacy rules and so forth, you as a voter don't know anything about them. You don't know how they performed in their previous jobs and so forth. So it's a question of just looking at names. And sometimes, if you know lawyers, you might say, oh, you know so-and-so, and
right,
so forth, whatever. Which isn't, of course, the good word we use for everything is transparency. There is no transparency when we're asked to vote on judges, which is unfortunate. And the other part is our rampant corruption. What do we know about anybody? Well, we know that they have a lot of money, a lot of people who are, writing ads for them, a lot of them managing them. We don't know the real person at all anymore. I mean, we've got a broken system.
There is no money.
And it is very difficult. And part of the issue, of course, is that in time past, most judges were appointed. And we felt that was a corrupt system because they were being appointed by people who had a particular agenda to accomplish by that appointment. And so we demanded that we get the right to elect them. And then in the process of demanding that, we've also given ourselves the right to vote, but not to investigate. And
Well, judges, you can't investigate.
that's my point. We let ourselves vote for them, but we don't let ourselves investigate. And it does put us in a very difficult position.
So what do we do? Cry.
You'd be surprised how much crying and complaining and raising a ruckus when you see things that, upon careful examination, do appear to be miscarriages, can actually produce results. Not as quickly as we'd like, and not in every case that we'd like, but it does have the power to change. And we'll get to the personal implications, but I just want to give a little time, and actually we have only a little time, so I'm going to take the last two paragraphs here. So in capital cases, non-capital cases, this is where the death penalty is not involved, they may reverse a verdict. That means the judges can reverse their verdict, either from conviction to acquittal or from acquittal to conviction. This means if new evidence is brought to light for someone who was a thief, or someone who was being accused of punching someone, and it proves that they're innocent, they can be let off the hook, and if it proves they were guilty, they can be put back on the hook. So in American law, we have the principle of double jeopardy. You can't be tried twice for the same case. In Jewish law, for non-capital cases, if very clear new evidence comes to light, new witnesses, yes, you can, even if you were acquitted, be tried for that case a second time. Make sense? I'm not saying you agree to it, but makes sense. However, in capital cases, they can reverse a verdict from conviction to acquittal, but not from acquittal to conviction. Once someone has been cleared of a capital crime, they cannot be tried again, no matter what new evidence comes to light. However, once someone has been convicted of a capital crime, they can be tried again if new evidence comes to light that would exonerate them. You see the distinction? Right? You can only get off the hook if you're on the hook for the death penalty. But once you're off it, no one can put you back on. And in fact, they go so far, if we keep reading, that when the trial is completed, he, meaning the condemned, is led forth to be stoned. And the place of stoning was outside of the court. As it is said, bring out him that has cursed, from Vayikra. But even though he's being led away from the court, a man was stationed at the door of the court with handkerchiefs in his hand. And a man on a horse was stationed at a distance, yet within sight of him. So we've got our pardon the Greco-Roman building, but that's what we use in America. You've got your court with your guy with a handkerchief, and you've got your guy on the horse. It's a horse. And then you've got the place.
Looks like an ibis.
And then you've got the place where he's going to die, right? You got the place of execution. And you got a guy here with a handkerchief and a guy on the horse. You can still see him. So that if one says, I have something further to state in his favor, he, the guy with the handkerchief, waves the handkerchief, and the guy on the horse runs and stops them. So if someone comes to the courthouse and says, I heard there was a trial about Bob. I know something that can clear his name. They start signaling, the horse starts running, and they stop the execution. We got that? And even if he, meaning the man who's been convicted, says, I have something to plead in my own favor, this is while he's walking to his execution. He is brought back 4 or 5 times. In fact, there is no ultimate limit. If he still has something new to add that might clear his name, the execution is delayed over and over and over again, providing, however, that there is substance to it in his assertion. So he does have to provide something of why he thinks his name should be cleared. He can't just say, I'm innocent, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. If they find him innocent, they discharge him. But if not, he goes forth to be stoned, and a herald precedes him, saying, so-and-so, son of so-and-so, is going forth to be stoned because he committed such and such an offense. This is not to his shame, but, and so-and-so are his witnesses. Whoever knows anything in his favor, let him come and state it. They're not having the announcement of his execution so we can all come and watch and jeer and have those horrible executions that used to take place in Europe and even in our country with public deaths in order to have the crowd be titillated. They are doing this to make sure that everybody knows who it is and who's testifying against him, because you only get executed based on eyewitness testimony, so that if someone has something to say in his favor or against the witnesses to prove that they are lying, that he can be let off without being executed. That's the length that our ancestors went to try and ensure that justice would truly be done, that it would truly be tzedek before the execution took place, that they went to as far a length as possible to make sure that no one who was innocent, God forbid, should ever be executed, because you can't really fix that. You can fix the other stuff, you can get the money back, and you can get the property to change hands again, but once they're dead, that's kind of final, as they say.
And there were very, very few executions.
Very, very few. And the standard for when someone could be executed was very, very high. The evidence that was needed and the circumstances that were needed were very, very limiting. So executions were not very frequent. I have heard now that Texas is running out of the lethal injection drug because they have executed so many, and because the main suppliers of it don't want to sell to Texas anymore, because they don't want it used only for executions, and many of the suppliers are in Europe, and they will not ship that drug to the United States now for fear that it'll be used in capital punishments.
One of the translations I read uses the term reliable witnesses.
Well, yes, there was always a notion that the witnesses themselves would be vigorously cross-examined during a capital case. And since the principle of Eidin Zumamin, of false witnesses, meant that if you testified falsely, whatever punishment the other guy was going to get, you got instead, there was a very high standard for testimony. Imagine in the American legal system, if someone was going to testify against a murderer, that they knew if they were found out to be lying, they would be executed instead of the guy they were trying to get executed. I think people might be a little bit more careful about making the assertion, oh no, I'm sure, even though it was dark and I was hit in the head, it must have been him. They might be a little bit more circumspect before they would send people, as we know, who have...
do away with these people who make plea bargains to testify against someone.
Certainly, yes. If you are testifying in order to get a benefit to yourself and are lying in the process to do so, then you are going to be in a very bad situation. So yes. But to take this back to the month of Elul, to this month of introspection, we say tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice we shall pursue. Now often for many of us, that means when we have a problem, whether it be with another person, whether it be with a company, the sales rep, whoever it might be, things that make us angry and that often make us behave angrily. We think we are doing it because we are trying to pursue justice. But we need to be willing to understand that if there is evidence that exonerates the other, that if there are other reasons that we may not be privy to, that is why they made the judgment that they gave, we should be prepared to give people the benefit of the doubt. We should be prepared to say, let's hold off on punishing them by not talking to them or by speaking badly about them behind their back or by doing other things. We need to pursue justice even when it's not exactly what we feel we want, because we feel wronged, we feel aggrieved. We need to be ready to be patient, to examine the case more carefully, and perhaps even forgive. So, Rosh Chodesh Tov, have a good new month of Elul. Go through all the difficult job of that spiritual soul searching, and maybe all have a wonderful new year at the beginning of the end of this month. Take care.